sticking around, we have another World War II veteran joining us now. He's a veteran of the Canadian Army in World War II, Nick Janicki, and he's going to be interviewed by the greatest history teacher in Canada, and that is Scott Masters. Scott Masters is here. He knows Nick. Nick is on Zoom. Nick was in a legendary regiment or a brigade. Scott, was it?
We'll ask Nick about that in just
We'll ask him
a moment.
about it. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to you, Scott. Thank you, Glenn, for hosting. Thank you, Julian, for being on this past hour.
Thank you, Julian.
Yeah, thank
Oh,
you. And Todd, great to see you again, and Glenn, you as well. You guys can see I'm wearing my poppy here. You can also see there are a fair number of young people in the room tonight because I decided to be daring and invite my students, at least a few of them. And I'm glad to see that one of them is wearing his poppy, which is fantastic. Julian, a much, much smaller school than where you taught. We're only about 600 students or so. So it's a totally different kind of situation. But it's really great to be here. I've had the occasion to speak with Nick on a few instances now. He's joining us from British Columbia, where it's just about 3 in the afternoon. He's got an absolutely incredible story to tell. So, Todd, if you want to go ahead and unmute Nick or ask him to unmute, and I think we can get started here in a couple of moments. And students, you guys pay close attention. You get to learn a very interesting story from a really interesting Canadian veteran. So, Nick, it's really nice to see you again. How are you doing tonight?
Let's see. I asked Janicki's iPad
It's
to.
Nick Janicki.
Okay. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
that's okay.
I saw Janicki's iPad. I thought that was it. Oh no, there's Nick Janicki. Okay, of course. Hey, George Zagstruck, good to see you. I hope you're well. I haven't seen you in a while. Here we go. There we go.
Hi, Nick. How are you doing?
Very good, Scott.
Excellent. Great to see you again. And Kathy, it's really nice to see you again too. Thanks for getting your dad connected once again. And Nick, I wanted to begin by wishing you a belated happy birthday. You had a pretty big birthday about 2 months ago. How old are you now?
September 8th, I was 100 years old.
Well,
Yeah.
a belated happy
Yeah.
birthday from everybody in the room. And Nick, I thought I would give a quick explanation how you and I met because British Columbia is pretty far away from
Yeah.
Toronto. And Todd, you would find this to be a very interesting story as well. There's a young filmmaker in Canada by the name of Eric Brunt, and I guess it'd be about 5 years or so ago now. He decided to do a cross-country trip and interview World War II veterans in all the different parts of Canada. And I think he ended up interviewing something like 700 veterans during a year-long journey. Just absolutely incredible. And Nick would have been one of the very first people he came across. I was lucky to link up with Eric when he made his way to Toronto, and he shared some interviews with me. And we got to talking, and I asked him if he thought there'd be any World War II veterans out there who would be interested in a Zoom. And Nick, you were one of the very first people that Eric recommended to me, and we've had the opportunity to get to learn your story over the years. So thank you so much for taking some time with us today.
Okay. Yeah, please do.
Excellent. So,
Yeah.
Nick, I always like to ask, a question about your early life to get these things started. And hopefully you're going to notice my students taking diligent notes. I see another one has put her poppy on since I mentioned that comment a few moments ago. But Nick, I'd love it if you could tell us just a little bit about your life growing up in British Columbia before the war.
Before the war?
Yep.
Uh, well, I'm a Canadian. I'm in Canada, and I was born in a little community called Stout, BC, across the Fraser River from Yale. My dad worked for the railroad, and yeah. What else?
How big a family did you come from, Nick?
Well, my mom and dad, and I had three brothers and a sister. Yeah, there's only two of us left now. That's my younger brother. He just turned 96, and myself. So, yeah.
Okay, and we'll talk about your older brother's story, of course. That's a big part of this. He went into the army before you, and
Yeah.
you followed him right into the Scottish. And Todd had a question about that. How do we describe the Scottish as a regiment or a
It's
division?
it's a it's a regiment. It's a Canadian Scottish Regiment. Yes, and its home base is in Victoria, BC. Yeah.
Okay. So what I thought I would do, Todd, with your permission, I'm a Canadian teacher with a room of many Americans. I wanted to give sort of a really, really quick, and I promise, really, really quick overview of some of the elements of the war, and that'll set us up to hear about what Nick went through right at the very end of the war. So to my students who are in the room, most of these kids right now are studying the 1920s and the 1930s. We're getting very close to the Second World War. You guys get the bonus of getting a preview from Mr. Masters on a Saturday, which I'm sure is an incredibly thrilling thing for all of the kids in the room here today. So I'll go ahead and get my slides ready here. And I thought a very quick introduction to me would be useful as well. A lot of you guys, have gotten to know me, of course, over the many years that I've been doing the Veterans Breakfast Club now. It's been, a pretty important part of my regime since the pandemic, and I'm so happy to make these connections. And I actually went down to Pittsburgh this summer and had the opportunity to meet Todd and quite a number of the others. So what brought me to it is this. Both of my grandfathers happen to be veterans. One grandfather, who I'm circling here, was a veteran of the First World War. He lived to be 105, and I got to listen to his stories all through my teenage years. This is my other grandfather who served in the Canadian Navy during the Second World War. That's Grandpa Masters right there. But that, I would say, really set me on a path to be incredibly interested in history. And it's something, that never left me, something that I always wanted to be able to return to. So I decided when I did become a history teacher that introducing my students to veterans would be one of the most important things I could do. We started by inviting veterans into the classroom, and this photo goes back quite a few years now. Then I started taking students out into the community, to local hospitals. You can see that the students had great enjoyment in terms of doing selfies as we met the vets. And then we started doing Zoom. And Todd, you'll be happy to know I chose the photo of our very own Mark Spiridigliosi when we met him a couple of years ago. It's been a big part of my program. I've always enjoyed having students directly connect to the community, and we've built this web page where we have almost 1,000 interviews on there now, and about 600 of them are with World War II veterans. So we all know the basic history. Hitler invades Poland, September 1st, 39. The British and the French declare war 2 days later. Prime Minister Mackenzie King of Canada famously waits 1 week to get involved. He wanted to demonstrate Canada's independence, and the 1 week wait was a big part of that. And then from there, the war effort really started to kick into high gear. Tens of thousands of men get involved. As my students are learning right now, a lot of that had to do with the Great Depression and just the lingering impacts there. One point I like to make to American audiences, if you're not familiar, this was the flag that Canada fought under in the Second World War. So the connection to England was a really, really big part of the story. On the home front, Canadians supported the war effort in just about every way you can imagine. And the air training plan was a really, really big part of that. Some of you might remember the veteran Ken Lett that I brought on the show a couple of years ago, who talked about his experiences at that time. Battle of the Atlantic, proportionately, I think was probably the most important part of Canada's role. And we had a really touching Remembrance Day ceremony just yesterday where we invited about 20 veterans to the school, and 4 of them were World War II veterans who were involved in the Battle of the Atlantic, either on the high seas or in the air as patrol. Definitely a critical part of Canada's involvement. Many people are well aware of the Dieppe raid, the really, really difficult raid in the summer of 1942 that was so tragic for Canadian and American and British forces at that time. And of course, the Canadian involvement in Italy. When I was on a couple of years ago, Todd, I invited a vet by the name of Don White, who shared his experiences moving up through the Italian peninsula alongside American and British forces. And of course, Todd, I'm sure you well remember talking to Jim Parks about a year ago. He sends his regards, by the way. I just saw him recently. But Canadians stormed Juno Beach, and that's going to open up the involvement in the Northwest campaign. And Nick, that's very much where your story comes into it. So this is a fantastic photo that you had. And Nick, I know this one from 1943 is you, I think just before you went overseas. When was this other one taken, Nick? The one of you wearing the tan?
That one was taken in 46, just after I come back from the war. Yeah.
Okay. So this other one is just before you go overseas. I take it you're
before I went. Yes, before I went overseas.
Okay, so you're about 19 or 20 years old here, right?
Yep. Yeah, that'd be about right.
Absolutely. So, Nick, how long were you in England when you did end up going overseas? How much time did you spend there?
I arrived in England in early January 45. And I was in England just, until the first part of February. I was waiting to be moved over as a reinforcement to the Canadian Scottish Regiment in Europe. Yeah.
Okay. How did you end up in the Canadian Scottish? What was it that drew you into that regiment?
Well, during that period of time, of course, I was reinforcements to the Canadian Army, and I was sent overseas to the Canadian Scottish Regiment, and I joined the Canadian Scottish Regiment in Europe.
Okay. And at the time you land, Nick, if I remember correctly, when you crossed the channel, was it in Ostend where you landed?
Yeah, went from Dover to Ostend in Belgium, and then from there to Ghent, and then we're just in Ghent a very short time, and then into a forested area not too far from Ghent, where the Canadian Scottish Regiment were stationed at the time. They were waiting. They're at the front lines, and they're waiting to cross the Rhine River into Emmerich. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's when I joined the Canadian Scottish Regiment.
Yeah. And as the map shows here, we've talked about D-Day in this show on so many occasions. After the American forces did the breakout and went inland across the more central part of France, Canadian forces stuck to the Channel, and it was basically their job to liberate the Channel ports. The Battle of the Scheldt and Antwerp and so forth. So Nick is basically fighting his way along through here into Belgium. And I guess, Nick, especially into the Netherlands is probably where you have most of your memories.
Yeah, my biggest part of it would be the Netherlands, yes.
Now, were you involved in the Scheldt at all, Nick, or did you arrive after that fighting?
Just after. That Scheldt, I believe, was probably possibly where my brother was killed, somewhere in there. And I ended up, let's see, I just can't remember, but I wasn't in the Scheldt. No, I wasn't involved in that.
Okay, and you mentioned before your arrival in Europe, and I think that these photos were taken very shortly after you arrived on the continent.
Yeah, well, the one on the left was taken after the war by a little Dutch gal that I met in Deventer when we liberated Deventer, and that was a picture that they took of me there. She took of me after the war. And the other two pictures up on the right-hand side were taken in Belgium. And we're in a kind of a tent holding area. Yeah.
How long was it, Nick, before you went into combat for the first time?
Well, basically, the minute I hit the forest, we were in front lines, and then we crossed the Rhine River just near Emmerich, where the engineers had built Bailey bridges across the Rhine River, just below Emmerich, and I can always remember that. So that's where I really saw the first real flash of real war, where they had lined up all these rocket machines and cannons and everything else, and they were firing into Emmerich there with tracer shells, and Emmerich was being bombed and shelled, and we went in this evening across the Bailey bridges, and sort of then the next day into Emmerich, and that's when I was the first real part of the war that I saw. Of course, when we hit Emmerich, there was not much left of Emmerich. It was pretty well rubble and flattened out. And the German soldiers, there weren't many around, and they were all on the run. And this was, I guess, this was the start of us sort of chasing the Germans out of the country, eh?
Yeah. And Nick, do you recall what you thought or what you felt the first time you were under fire? Were you afraid, or did your training kick in?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you didn't know what to expect, eh? Everything was sort of new to me, going into the front lines and not knowing what was going to happen. And sure, you're concerned and afraid, and I don't know how you expect, but we had a job to do, and that's what we were there for. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And Nick, you mentioned something a couple of moments ago that I'm sure caught people's attention, and that has to do with the story of your older brother David. I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about him before the war. How much older was he? What kind of a man was he?
Oh, okay. David was 2 years older than I, and before he went into the service, he worked for a restaurant as a waiter and that. And then he joined the services, and he was in Canada for a couple of years, and then he was sent to England, and he was sent into England, and he did his training and was preparing for D-Day and crossing the English Channel. But yeah, Dave, he was a great guy, and I just miss him so much. Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
He just he was a brother that I never ever really got the opportunity. An older brother that I never ever got the opportunity to know who he really was at the end. Yeah.
And I notice in the photos you shared, he always seems to have a smile on his face. You can just tell that he was a nice man. And I don't remember. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, I don't remember the exact circumstances of this photo, but I think this was a cousin of yours, right? It's not his daughter.
No, that was my younger sister. That was taken of her just before he went overseas. Yeah, yeah.
And he was part of the Scottish as well, right?
Yeah, he went to England, and he was with the Scottish Regiment there. He did his training for D-Day, and he crossed the English Channel with the Canadian Scottish, and he fought every battle that the Canadian Scottish Regiment were in. He never missed a battle. He started as a private, and he ended up as a sergeant. At the time that he was killed, he was sort of an acting officer, because there were so many, they lost so many personnel in this one place, and that's where he was when he was actually killed, and it was on the sort of the border of, I guess, the German border and the Dutch border, and yeah. But he fought every battle there was with the Canadian Scottish before he got it on February the 9th, 1945.
Nick, how did you learn about this? How did you learn about your brother's death?
I was still in Aldershot when that happened, and it happened on he was on the 9th, and it was the morning of the 10th that the sergeant from the gate at Aldershot came down and called me out and informed me that Dave had been killed the day before. Yeah.
And
yeah.
Being that you ultimately fought in the same regiment, I've got to imagine that's a little bit of an unusual circumstance, but you actually fought alongside some of the men that your brother knew.
Yeah, when I went into the regiment, I went into the Canadian Scottish Regiment, and I went into the same platoon that he was in charge of or in command of. And I went into the exact same platoon that he belonged to, and I met some of the guys that knew Dave when they were with him. And so I can remember this one time when we hit a little kind of a shell hole, and I jumped into it, and all of a sudden there was some sniping from a German sniper, and this chap was a Bren gunner, and he says, "Hey kid," he says, "keep your head down." He says, "There's a sniper shooting our way." And then he asked me who I was, and I told him, and he said, "Well, I knew your brother well." Yeah. And so it was sort of a, I become part of them because of a lot of that, and meeting a lot of the people that Dave was with over the while. Yeah.
Do you remember any stories that they might have shared about him?
Well, yeah, they used to always say that whenever they were anywhere and they were dug in or something, and in the evenings, who would be carrying the old rum bottle around? But it'd be Dave to all the guys along the line. To have their little ration the night before their But yeah.
And I got to say, oddly enough, that's not the first rum story that my students have heard this week.
Yeah.
I should explain that so people don't get the wrong impression.
I can remember one other one about David and our chaplain. He was the chap that got to know Dave quite well, and he he told me the story about when things were kind of tough and I needed my hair done up or something. He said Dave used to be a little bit of a barber type of guy too, and he said so we'd find some nice tree there in the shade and get an old box, and I'd sit on the box, and Dave would be trimming my hair while we talked about what was going on during the war. Yeah.
Fascinating. And I should finish my comment from a moment ago, just not to leave people with any misperception there. But Todd, this week we've been doing lots of interviews as part of the lead up to Remembrance Day. And on Thursday, we connected with a British veteran by the name of Harry Waddingham, who's 107 years old, believe it or not. And he was in the Royal Navy. You can't talk to somebody in the Royal Navy without asking about the rum ration. And given his age, he was born in 1916, believe it or not. He turned 25 in 1941, after the Dunkirk evacuation. And he remembered many of his shipmates sharing their rum ration with him on his 25th birthday. And I'm sure the kids will remember he told them a pretty colorful story about it, but I don't want to get too far into that here. Now, Nick, I remember you recounting the story to me of your brother's death, and it's a pretty awful one, given what happened. Do you mind sharing that story?
Yeah. This battle they were in was an area the Padre wrote up on and said that it was very essential that the Canadian Army was to hold that position, very essential with the war to keep going on the way it was. And of course, they took over this area, and they had taken about, I guess, 60 prisoners and officers, as well as the regular German army guys. And so David and them and his runner went back to check the area just to see if there might have been some of their own people that were still wounded there and that. And David and the runner, they came along to this big shell hole, and they stepped into it, and they sort of, just about when they stepped into it, there was two German soldiers came out of the bush, and one of them waving a white flag and the other one behind them. And when they got out in the open, the chap with the white flag stepped aside, and the other chap opened up with a Smiser and killed my brother instantly, and wounded the runner. The runner lost his leg through it all, and they took these two guys, eventually took these two guys prisoner, and they mixed them with the rest, and they didn't really know who they were after that day, because they didn't, and this is what happened to them. It was just, as a matter of fact, I was over there in April this year, and there was a chap by the name of Bernard that was a very good friend of a friend of mine that's a captain in the Dutch Army. And he arranged with Bernard, because Bernard lived very close to in the area where David was killed. And so he asked if he could show us the area. And so we went, and I can remember driving up this little road and to a little hillside, and we stopped at this big house, and Walter said to him, he said, well, why are we stopping here? He said, well, I wanted to bring you here because this house here during this battle was the Canadian Scottish Regiment's headquarters. And then from there, we went down onto the flats, and in the flat area, this is where they flooded that whole area. This is when the Canadian was known as the water rats and that too. And anyway, we went down there, and Bernard says, I'm going to show you where your brother was killed. And so we went down there, and we drove along, and we went by an old house, and he said, that old house there was the German headquarters. And he said, where we're standing right now, if you look over that way, it might be 50, 100 feet. That's where your brother was killed. And it sure came home, eh? And Walter at the time went over because they'd plowed all these fields, and picked up a little bit of dirt, and he come back, and he had some old rusted shrapnel in his hand that was there, still there from the last war, eh? Yeah. So that was kind of, that was kind of it was kind of a closure for me to know exactly where David was killed and everything else. And then from there, we went to the museum, and then to the cemetery where Dave's stone is and where he's buried, eh? And all of it, yeah.
And it must be incredibly compelling for you after all this time to be able to return, to see those locations.
Yeah.
Nick, I'm curious. At the time, you mentioned you were in England, still in Aldershot when you learned this. What kind of allowances does the military give you in that situation? Do they have some sort of a funeral or a furlough? Do they do anything?
No, nothing, because I was out of there in 2 days, and I was over to Dover and heading to Europe, heading to Belgium, and Holland, yeah. So it was just one of those things, sad things, and of course it was a tough thing. And mind you, I was thinking my mom and dad, with Dave over there being killed and me still there. I was more concerned about how they were feeling than me. That sort of, I guess that sort of helped me along with the whole issue, eh?
For sure. Now, Nick, if you're open to it, one of my students bravely wants to get involved and ask a question. Todd, I unmuted him, and there's a few kids who may ask some questions tonight, Todd, and feel free to get me to pause if there's anything in the chat that comes up or whatever. But
yes, and I will say, if you want to ask a question, you could raise your Zoom hand or just wave your hand in front of the camera or put it in the chat, and we'll ask you to unmute.
So, Michael, go ahead.
Okay, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. And I want to ask, did that affect your attitude towards the Germans?
Did that affect your attitude towards the Germans after David was killed?
Well, yeah, I would say yes. I felt like there was, there's something that I had to do to sort of get even with it all, and I don't know. You're bound to have some feeling towards the other people about what happened to them, and particularly under the circumstances where they came out waving a white flag, eh? So the war continued on after that, and I don't think that the regiment took any prisoners after that till we liberated Deventer. And I think I can remember we'd taken 3 prisoners, and I can remember Sergeant Robbie saying to me, he says, "Kid," he says, I think we're even about now." He says, "We have these 3 prisoners. You can take them back to B echelon or do what you have to do with them." And so I remember taking the 3 prisoners back, and as it was going along, 2 German soldiers stepped out of a house, and they had their helmets on and their weapons, and I went like this: "Throw your helmets away, throw your weapons down." They didn't, so they got in line. So instead of taking 3 prisoners, I took 5 back to B echelon. And B echelon was kind of a holding area where they looked after prisoners during the war. And she had turned them over there, and then I was back with the regiment, and we continued our battle through Deventer. Yeah. I don't know whether that helps or...
No, I think that answers a question that probably a number of people were thinking, given the circumstances. One of my students just sent a note about that, but I think that answer is very well taken. I'm going to bring back up the slides that I had there just a moment ago, because there's a few other things that I wanted to address. Let me just go ahead and get that up here. But obviously, the liberation of the Netherlands, Nick, is going to be such an important part of Canada's wartime experience. We invited the Dutch Consul General in Toronto to our assembly the other day, and he did a really magnificent speech talking about the special relationship between Canada and the Netherlands. And Nick, he brought us an unbelievable number of tulip bulbs. We had a very nice ceremony planting tulip bulbs, and I even was able to bring home a couple of bags. I was wondering if you could share some of your memories, what it was like for you passing through the villages and the towns in the Netherlands, and what kind of interactions you remember having.
Well, at that time we had the Germans on the run, and we were going through all these little towns, and we were liberating some of the bigger cities, and the Dutch people were just so appreciative of the fact that we were there, and we were sort of giving them their freedom back. And I just have so much good feelings about the Dutch people. They've just been outstanding, and they treated me like I just don't know how to explain it. They're just a terrific bunch of people. Yeah.
Absolutely. And all these years later, they continue to recognize that. I'm going to play a short clip here, Nick. I'm just going to be certain I have the volume down, but this is one of many scenes of liberation footage. And I'm just wondering if you had an experience along these lines. Is this the kind of thing that you would see?
Oh, I'll never forget when this is very familiar, and I can remember April the 10th, 45, when we got the orders to go through to start the liberation of Deventer, and we crossed this open field, and there's my cutie Dorothy there, and we crossed this open field and got into the city, and then we fought our way through. And I can remember once the city was cleared, our colonel got us all together and marched us down this main street in Deventer, and there were people lined up on rooftops, on the sidewalks, hanging out windows, waving, and there was just so much joy in the air. The way they expressed what we had done and given them their freedom after 5 years of German occupancy was just outstanding. And the little blonde girl on the right side, that was a girl by the name of Dorothy Walthews, and I met her then. And of course, after I'd come back to Canada, we didn't have any communication for 58 years. When I got back home, I got married and had 3 children. Dorothy got married, had 3 children, and my wife passed away. And in a couple of years, I got in touch with Dorothy, and she had been widowed, and we got together 58 years later. Hadn't seen one another. We got together, and I eventually married the gal. And now Dorothy had been gone for 10 years now. The picture on the left side of the chap by the name of Corporal Hackle up on the right, myself there, and this Dutch lady and her 2 daughters, was a place where my brother was billeted for a short time when he went through Nijmegen. And they were very good friends. As a matter of fact, the 2 girls came to Canada after, and I met them in Canada. And the one picture there was taken in Ada with the kitchen crew, and this one was just after the war had ended.
Now, I think Todd might have a question there. I noticed his expression when you were talking about Dorothy. It's a pretty incredible story.
That's an incredible story. How did you locate Dorothy after 58 years?
My first wife and I went to Holland. We made a trip to Holland. We did a bus tour. And during that time, I sent a letter to the family and said they're coming over and I'd like to get in touch. And there was nobody at the address, please forward the letter on. So they did to Dorothy's brother in a small village outside of Deventer. And so when my wife and I went over there to visit, we visited Dirk, Dorothy's brother, and that's when we found out that Dorothy was in America and she was in Las Vegas and she was married. So all that, and so that's how I knew she was in Vegas. And then when my wife passed away, of course, I had a sister-in-law that says, hey, we got to do something about you. You must have a couple old girlfriends around. I said, yeah, one was a school teacher. She's not around anymore. But Dorothy, the little Dutch girl who lives in Las Vegas. And she said, well, I think you should phone her. And so I put it on the shelf, and I said, well, here, she's married and all that. Why go there? And so for about a week, I walked around, and I finally decided to phone. So I had the phone number that Dirk had given me, and I tried phoning her, and I finally got the operator, and the operator said, well, that phone's out of order. And she says, who are you looking for? And I said, well, I'm looking for Dorothy Spencer. And she says, well, I'll look through the directory. And she came back to me and she said, well, we got a Dave Spencer. I said, no, it wouldn't be Dave Spencer because her husband was Lyle. And so anyway, she said, just a minute. And she said, I'll go through the directory again. And she says, I've got a D Spencer. And it looks like it could be an apartment or a hotel or something. She says, I've got the phone number. I can give it to you, or I can phone right now. And I said, well, I've taken up enough of your time. Let's phone. So she phoned, and the phone rang 4 times. This lady answered the phone, and I said, I didn't introduce myself. I just said, I'm looking for Dorothy Spencer. She says, I'm a Dorothy Spencer. I said, well, I'm looking for a Dorothy Spencer that once lived in El Parque Drive. She says, I'm that Dorothy Spencer. And I said, okay, one more question. I said, you got a brother named Dirk in Harson, Holland? She says, yes. Who the hell are you? And I hadn't introduced her, eh? So that started it. And so then I made it. I had told her that I had plans to go to Vegas. She had told me that her husband had been gone for 8 years. So I said, I'd like to get together. And that's what happened. 58 years later, I met Dorothy again, and I maybe had 1 or 2 letters in all that time between the end of the war and before then. And it's just an amazing story. And so anyway, we got together and eventually we married. And I was married to Dorothy for 10 years, and she'd been gone for 10 years now. So, yeah.
What a beautiful story. How wonderful.
Yeah, a story all by itself.
Yeah.
Really, really nice. I also want to ask Nick, there's one other picture here. I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger for a moment because I remember you describing this to me very colorfully before. I think you mentioned this was the kitchen crew that you were with.
Uh-oh. I don't like the looks of this.
Tell us about the guy in white.
The guy in the white, he's the chef, and he's holding a little pig there that they're going to barbecue, I think. And the guy in the right hand was a guy by the name of Bonte, and he came close from where I lived here, and he married a Dutch gal and came back to Canada. We have a chap over here by the name of Dick Bellick that came from Paul River over here. But this was the kitchen. The officers had taken over this small hotel, and after the war, we got stationed back in this area in some barracks, and I ended up going to the hotel and working in the officers' bar and driving the Padre. I drove the Jeep for the Padre after the war. Yeah. So that's, yeah. Lots of stories.
Yeah, absolutely remarkable. Nick, how long did you stay in the Netherlands when the war was concluded? How much longer did you spend?
Well, the war ended May 5th in Germany, and we went back to a place called Ada, just out of Deventer, and we were there until I guess late in November. It had to be in November. We went back to Aldershot, and we were waiting in Aldershot to come back to Canada as a regiment. So we left from Aldershot. We went to Greenock, Scotland, and this was just before Christmas, so 45. And we went to Greenock, Scotland. We boarded the Queen Elizabeth, which was a troop ship in those days, and sailed to New York. And then to New York, we went by rail across Canada to Victoria to the home base. Yeah.
And another one of my students bravely wants to ask a question right now. And I know that you have got some fantastic photos on this, Nick, so I'll bring it up in a moment. But Sidney, go ahead.
Hi, sir. It's an honor to meet you. I was just wondering, what are some of your fondest memories of returning to the Netherlands over the years?
My fondest memories? Well, that's a tough one. They've been all good memories. And of course, uh, my fondest memory, no matter when I go back to the Netherlands, or that you seem so welcome, eh? And the Dutch people just, I don't know, they're just somebody special. I just love them, and I go back because my brother is buried in the cemetery at Gooswick, beautiful cemetery, and I've been there about 4 times now. And I hope maybe next year and the year after I can do it again. And but the Dutch people have just done something so great. You know, there's one thing they've embedded in their family. They embedded in their family who the people were that liberated them, and they just respect the Canadian people, soldiers, so much for what they've done for them. And they just go out of their way to make you so welcome.
Absolutely. And Nick, you did a pretty important trip there not too long ago. I'd love it if you could tell us about your most recent trip to the Netherlands.
Well, okay, I'll start with this picture here. This picture here on the left is in the Holton Cemetery. And I had been interviewed, and then the one day, and then the next day they did some filming of this. This was the Holton Cemetery, and there was a chap by the name of Clayton Mitchell that was our commanding officer when we were liberating Deventer. That he was killed in action at that time, and I was going in there to visit his graves and some of the other graves of the other fellows that we'd lost there, because my understanding with Holton Cemetery, all the Canadian soldiers, or most of them that were killed on the Dutch soil, were buried in Holton, and the ones that were killed on German soil were killed in buried in Goosebrack. And the picture on the right-hand side, and I was telling you a minute ago about this chap that was going to show me where Dave was killed. Well, this is a chap there. That's Bernard, and he's in the Dutch army, and he's just about ready to retire. He took me down to show me the area where David was killed, and he's pointing to the area at that point where Dave was killed. Yeah. And my recent trip to the Netherlands, I went there, and I was invited there as a guest of honor to attend the Wagenbergen parade, and I was the only Canadian World War II veteran in attendance. Yeah.
And Nick, I was very taken by this photo with the young girl. Can you explain the context behind that?
This is the young girl. She wrote me a letter, and on the 2nd of May, when I hit the Netherlands, she had what the Dutch people were doing. They had all their students between I think 13 and 16 write letters to a veteran, and she wrote a letter to me to me. And the letter I got was from her, and it was a letter from Sasha, and I'm going to just take a minute of it, and I'm just going to say, just read just a part here. She says, "I am very grateful to you for what you have done for our country. Even if you only did a little bit, all the help was needed, and you gave it. You were someone who was against the Germans and who actually did something about it." And then she goes down at the end here, and she said, "Freedom and peace in our country means a lot to me. And as a result, I now have a good life. For me, freedom means that no one decides about me. Peace means that I can live and without wars and takeovers. And then she asked me a couple more questions. But Sasha, it's just funny you should mention her. I just put a parcel in the mail to her as a gift for our meeting. Okay, but she was a tremendous person, and yeah.
And let me just bring the pictures up again for a moment. We had a really remarkable Remembrance Day assembly at the school yesterday, Nick. We did it on Friday the 10th this year. I mentioned we had lots and lots of veterans in attendance. Todd, you'd certainly recognize Jack Boki right at the middle, who talked about his own story in the Netherlands. A number of vets from the Canadian Navy and Air Force involved in the Battle of the Atlantic. Holocaust survivors, and just a great group of students who did a fantastic job as well. Sidney, who asked a question a moment ago, there she is right there. And Sidney did a radio interview with me yesterday where she did really, really well also. With this very much in their minds, one of the students wanted to ask something about this. So Mackenzie, go ahead, please. Mackenzie, are you there? Oh, we got to ask you to unmute. My apologies. Oh, doesn't I think it looks like Mackenzie's having a problem with her mic, unfortunately. Yeah. But hey, what's a Zoom session without some sort of technical malfunction? But what Mackenzie had sent me in the chat, she wanted to know, Nick, what you think about most on Remembrance Day and what lesson you want students to take.
Well, Remembrance Day is kind of I made a short note. I just have to check, but it's Remembrance Day, November the 11th, eh? And of course, I get very emotional about November the 11th because, no matter what I'm doing on November the 11th, and I stop on November 11th for that 2 seconds of silence and freedom, and I think of my brother, and I think of some of the buddies that I lost, and it's just my way to, I guess, give tribute and honor and respect to those that lost their lives and those that fought so hard for what we have today, freedom and everything else. Just so many things go through my mind. I just, I'm just overwhelmed with it all. And I just don't know what to say. I'm just, yeah. Like I say, it's very emotional. And every November the 11th, I still think about my big brother. I never really got a chance to know. Yeah.
Well, I still find it incredible, Nick, to hear those emotional stories after all this time. And the students experienced that at the school the other day. We had a French resistance fighter, remembering the German invasion of 1940 as if it was yesterday, and he got very choked up. One of the Canadian Navy veterans, remembered one of his high school friends dying in a training accident right at the very start of his military service, and they told those stories with the same kind of emotion that you're expressing. So important for the students to hear that. Now, Todd, I see we got some fantastic people in the room. Perhaps they have some things they wanted to add.
For much of the hour, I've been thinking about George Zwijgstra, who I greeted not long ago, as Nick was talking about the special feeling he has for the Dutch people. George is Canadian, of course, now, but grew up in Holland and in the Netherlands, I should say, and was liberated by Canadians. George, I don't know if you want to echo what Nick had to say about the special relationship that the Netherlands has with Canada because of World War II. You can feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like. Nick, I think you also remind us that strong feeling about your brother. I mean, he was killed over 80 years ago, and yet that is still, that pain never goes away. You could recall it like that, and it's just something that you've learned to live with, and that's instructive in and of itself. Nick, thank you.
Good, thank you.
George, how are you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you very much for liberating us, Nick.
Yeah, good, George.
And I really enjoyed your story. And I thought you said I haven't seen you too much lately, but I'm on it quite often, but I don't go on with a picture. So I watched a few things, but we had kind of a bad time. I just lost my wife in June. And
Oh, I'm so
so
sorry,
things
George.
have. Anyway, everything is okay. Scott, nice to see you again.
Yeah.
Great to see
Yeah.
you too, George. There's one other man here I wanted to introduce real quickly, Todd. I know we're in our last minute or two here. I'm just asking him to unmute, but John Appel is also Dutch, and I've gotten to know him over the last little while. He lives not too far from me. John's got an incredible story in his own right. He grew up in what were then the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, present day. And as a very young boy, he was interned in a Japanese prison camp. He ended up making his way out. But John, I'm sure you'd have something to say to Nick. Go right ahead.
Yeah, sure, I have something to say to Nick. Well, a whole lot, but I'll keep it short. Yes, Nick, I wasn't in the Netherlands when you liberated that country, but my late wife was. What I wanted to mention is, well, you told us that your brother is buried at the war cemetery at Groesbeek. But unbeknown to most of us in Canada is that all the war graves of the Allied soldiers in the Netherlands have been adopted by Dutch families and children who maintain these graves. So every year before Remembrance and the American holidays, there's always a big but a very humane celebration to celebrate this. And that, I think, is a great thing that children, they're now what, 2 generations, 3 generations removed from the war, from the Second World War, are told and appreciate what happened to their parents, their great grandparents, and the liberation. So, but wholeheartedly, they maintain those graves. That's a great thing. Yeah, and the thing is, Nick, absolutely great story. And I'm with you there. If you lose a dear family member, you never forget. But for my late wife, I would like to thank you for your service, particularly in the Netherlands. Thank you.
Yeah, good, thank you. And I plan on, I was there for the 78th celebrations. I've got my calendar marked for the 79th and for the 80th, which will be in Wagon Glen. It'll be the national one. God willing, good health and mobility, I'll be there. I just can't stay away. I just love the place.
Oh,
that's an incredible story, Nick. Nick, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you again. I hope I get the chance to meet you in person one day instead of just over Zoom.
That'd be great. That'd be great. I'd love to do that.
And Nick, it's an honor for me to meet you also here on Zoom. And Scott, thank you so much for arranging this conversation with a real hero from World War II, 100-year-old Nick Janicki. What a story. What a memory. What energy you have. What heart and soul. It's just, thank you, Nick. That's all I could say.
And thank you very much. Thank you. It's been great to be on. Yeah.
And thank you for the students also for joining us for the hour. What a wonderful addition. That is, I mean, we at the Veterans Breakfast Club, we always say that, you know, when older people talk with younger people, that's when the magic really happens in our storytelling events. So thank you for the kids from Crestwood Preparatory College for joining us in Toronto. Thank you, Scott. Thank